Good evening and a very warm welcome to The Point. I'm Birgit and it's really wonderful to be with you for the program tonight. Well, the topic on the program this evening is about control in relationships in the form of domination, manipulation and intimidation. And joining me to discuss this is a director of LL Ministries and teacher at Pierpont, Jill Southern-Jones. Jill, welcome back to The Point.
Hello.
It's wonderful to have you to talk about this really important topic. And it's really interesting, Jill, because I remember we discussed this on one of the programs several years ago, and I was looking at that recently on YouTube, and the amount of people that have watched that material just indicates that this issue of control and ungodly control in relationships is pervasive. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I think we can get into relationships that can become very controlling, and we really don't know how to handle it or how to handle ourselves as our own free will choice is overridden by another person.
Yes. Well, we're discussing various forms that control can take in relationships, and I wonder if we could begin by just talking about each of those in turn and just hearing a little bit more in terms of definition and examples. So perhaps if we start with domination, how would you describe what domination is?
Yes, where one person dominates another person, it means that you're sort of pushed down and your opinion doesn't matter, and it's sort of dismissed, and so the other person just takes over really, and you start to think, well, I have to do what they want, I have to go where they want, maybe go on holiday where they want, or eat at the restaurant where they want to, and you don't get asked, and it can become very crushing.
Yeah, there is a real sense of power over in a situation where somebody is being dominated. As you say, the sense of somebody really being squashed and somebody else's will being brought to bear over you. Would you say that's right?
Yes, and it's amazing how that can happen in marriages. It can happen, obviously, of parents of adult children. It can be dominated not to have a boyfriend or go out and leave perhaps the widowed mother or whatever, and they can really spoil and crush and just reduce the person who becomes the victim if we don't stand up and say, sorry, this isn't working for me. And of course there can be huge consequences, because the other person can explode or blow in some form of way, or they can retaliate.
Yes, it would be really helpful to consider this more as the program goes on, but it helps to give a general understanding of what domination is. So if we also look at intimidation, how would you describe that?
Yes, if you're intimidated, it tends to have threats attached to it. So if you do this, then I will do that. So it can be with a child. You know, if you don't do this, then I'll kill your pet rabbit or whatever. So there can be a threat attached to it. So people getting their own way, getting us to behave or do something we wouldn't otherwise do, because we're underneath some terrible threat of violence, intimidation. If we don't.
And the threat can be seemingly immediate sometimes. It can be a longer term situation, as you say, X, Y and Z if you don't do this, but it can also be an immediate threat to a person in terms of their well-being.
A threat of violence, of course, or a threat of withdrawal of money. Even in a marriage, you know, won't pay you any housekeeping money unless you do this. Or you stay at home or whatever. So
it's really instilling fear in another person and taking away their free will.
Yes.
Yes.
So it's overriding one person's free will by another.
Yeah.
And using intimidation, threats, usually has violence attached to it, a threat of something.
Okay, so domination, intimidation, and the last form that we're looking at on the program is manipulation. How would you describe that?
Yes, we can be manipulated, like, after all I've done for you, how can you be so ungrateful? I've paid for all your education, and now look what you're doing. You're getting off and getting married, and it's all going to go to pot, sort of thing. You're just going to have babies and not going to have the professional life that I've really paid for. And so we can feel manipulated. So we have to do something that the other person is requiring of us. So it's very often the manipulation of parents of children adult children is quite big.
Yes.
And people even go into professions, or you can't possibly do anything except go into the family law firm. You know, this is what you've been brought up, almost brought into the world to do. So if the person actually wants to go off and be a landscape gardener, I mean, there's no chance, because they've got to do what the parents have manipulated them for.
It's really interesting what you're saying, that this form of control can really be brought to bear on a person's life throughout their whole life, from what you're saying, and certain family relationships, for example. And as you're describing what manipulation is, it sounds like a very kind of subtle, coercive way of controlling or getting your way in relationship with another person.
Yeah, now manipulation can be subtle and sort of very sneaky.
Yes.
Or it can be in your face.
Right. Okay.
You know, so there's two ways. It can be absolutely, it's almost like some form of blackmail, but they've got something over you.
Yes.
You know, because we've done this for you, then you owe us.
Yeah. So it's really instilling a sense of guilt in a person in order to get your way. Is that true?
Yes, I think that is true.
Yeah.
So we feel a real heel if we do anything other than the parent, perhaps, or person in the marriage again. You know, I've heard someone say, "I rescued her, so now she owes me."
I see.
I mean, that's the most terrible thing, isn't it, for a marriage? She's got to be my carer. I've got to do what I want, do my bidding, and can't do have her own life, or can't go out with her friends, or whatever it happens to be, because she owes me.
Again, at the heart of it seems to be this idea of taking away the free will choice of another person in all of these different ways.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, just as you were speaking, a thought came to mind about passive aggression, when a person is passive aggressive. Could you please perhaps explain what that is and whether that's a form of manipulation?
Yes, sometimes, again, this is the more subtle approach, but the person can withdraw relationship, basically.
Right.
So, I mean, even sulkiness. Someone's got a sulk on.
Yeah.
Now, why would a person sulk?
To create a sense of, like, for you to pity them, basically.
And they're not going to, they're withholding conversation, they're withholding relationship and fellowship with you because you are not doing what they want. So it's a sort of passive aggression, but it can be very strong.
Yes.
So, you know, the person's in a moodiness, which is unreliability of the emotions, you know, in order to get their own way.
Yeah.
So you've said no, and now they're sulking until you say yes.
So the only other form of control that I was hoping to ask you about is anger, uncontrolled anger, explosive, rageful anger. Would you say that's a form of control as well?
Yes, it is. People control through their anger.
Right.
I can remember my father would come home with a headache from the office, and my mother would say, "Don't upset your father, don't upset your father, you know, just go to your room and be quiet," you know, because she didn't want an explosion. Or we'd talk out of turn, and he was particularly sensitive today.
Yeah.
So people can explode, and that controls the group or the family. But the threat to explode. So my mother didn't want to have the explosion.
Yeah.
So she would tippy-toe round him, and therefore he could then exert that control through anger.
Yeah.
Or go back to your passive aggression. He hasn't exploded yet.
But it's the threat of
But
that.
it's a threat of that that's going
Yeah.
to completely control everyone's behaviour.
And I just wonder, as you're describing that, whether there are many people watching that can relate to this idea of having to walk on eggshells or sort of be on tenterhooks in order to really help somebody not explode or prevent that possibility happening. It must be a very stressful way of living within a family.
Yes, and I think that the person who's threatening to explode knows that it's a control.
Right.
This is how they control.
So can I ask you, Jill, what are the factors in a person's life which leads to them becoming a controlling person?
Yes, I mean, controlling people are usually fearful and insecure. So if ever you've worked for an insecure boss, you'll know it's just dreadful. And because they're out of their fear and their insecurity, they control all the time. So a person can be what we call a control freak. You know, I was a complete control freak, you know, in all relationships, because they're only safe when they're in control. So as soon as they're not in control of anything, they're insecure, they're unsafe and fearful.
Right. So rather than dealing with the feelings on the inside that are causing that kind of fear or insecurity, they attempt to control the circumstances on the outside so they don't feel that discomfort.
Yes, that's right. Now, of course, in all of our lives, we have things we can't control.
Yes.
You know, you can't control if you're sick.
Yeah.
Or if someone dies or whatever. So you're out of, and these sort of things terrify a control freak. Must be in control all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Control of the people in the family, control of the money, control of what happens in the house, control of who comes to the house, when they come to the house. I mean, the whole thing is about rigid control.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person feels safe because they're nothing, they're on the top of the of the pinnacle.
Okay.
And everybody has to do what they want.
So can I ask, would you say, or do you think that there are certain personality types that are more disposed to getting into a relationship with a controlling person?
Yes, I mean, if a person actually doesn't want to lead,
Mm-hmm.
then so we talk about husbands that won't lead sometimes,
Yes.
and wives who won't follow. So, of course, if the person who's supposed to lead doesn't want to lead, they'll abdicate, which is like we go back to Ahab and Jezebel here.
Yes.
Ahab was the king, but he completely abdicated his responsibility and allowed Jezebel, well, she's the strong one, she knows what to do, she's in charge, I'm not competing with that, I'll let her carry on. So he abdicated what he should have done and allowed her to usurp his rightful authority. And that's really the crux of what the controlling person does, so that what we might call a Jezebelic spirit can operate through a controlled person. So, we're seeing the person, but here's the person and here's the spirit controlling them.
Yes.
So if we should never submit to a controlling person. Because if this is the mother-in-law or whoever, and this is the power behind it, and this is the person, actually we're submitting to the power of darkness.
That is so interesting. It's so interesting because I wonder whether people can be in a relationship with a controlling person, say it's in a marriage, and in order to keep the peace or in order to keep harmony in the home, one person could think, well, I'll just give way, I'll give in, I'll capitulate, and it will keep the peace. And they actually think that what they're doing is a rightful kind of action. But from what you're saying there, what we're dealing with is actually something ultimately which is spiritual, and by giving way to that, we're actually allowing something which is ungodly.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because actually you're submitting to a power of darkness that's just operating through this person. Because that's how powers of darkness operate, doesn't it? They operate through somebody.
Yeah.
So this person is the controller, and we're submitting. If you take the person out of the equation, you're submitting to a controlling spirit.
Well, can I ask you in this situation, what would a person do if they're listening to us discuss this and they recognise it in their own family or church? What can a person do when they're dealing with this sort of spiritual reality?
Yes, I mean, we have a responsibility before God to listen to God and be directed by Him.
Yes.
So we should not be abdicating our own personhood, our own personal responsibilities in life by allowing somebody else to override and tell us what to do.
Right.
Because what happens when the day comes they tell you to do something wrong,
Yes.
unbiblical or immoral or
Yes.
dishonest?
Yeah.
Are you suddenly going to stand up to this power? Probably not. So because if we've been sort of conditioned into saying anything for a peaceful life, I don't really want I don't really want to stand up to this person. I'll just to have an easy life. I'll just do what they want.
Yes.
But of course, sooner or later, it's going to come and conflict
Yeah.
with what is right.
And I think it's really true what you say, that a person can ultimately become conditioned in a situation. Before you gave the example of a whole family setup where the spouse knows that if they behave in X, Y or Z way, it will create this response. So there's a conditioning that happens without the behaviour even taking place. Can I ask you about other effects that can happen to a family at the hands of a controlling person. What comes to mind actually is a person's confidence becomes eroded. Would you say that's another effect of being in a relationship with a
Yes, the
controlling
person gets reduced. But usually the Jezebelic spirit, which we might term it as, operates through women, mostly through women, not exclusively,
Right.
but mostly through women. So you get this matriarchal figure
Yes.
who must be obeyed, she who must be obeyed, and she's on the throne, and everybody allows it to happen. So the whole family is conditioned to doing what she says all the time. But
Yes.
of course, you don't have any self-confidence and you don't have any self-esteem, or you don't. In the end, you don't feel if you've got any self-worth.
Yes.
Because actually, you haven't got an opinion that's allowed to be expressed, and you can't do what God has raised you up to do. Actually, so everything's got to go through the matriarchal filter.
Yeah.
And if it's okay with her, then you're okay. But if it's not, then you can't do it.
Well, this is a very difficult predicament, actually, as we're speaking about it, because you have this person that has been systematically reduced over a period of time, and so they're in a state where they don't have a strong sense of self or their own worth or any kind of confidence. They're fearful because of the control that's been exhibited in this particular relationship. So what's the starting point for somebody in that position?
How to come out of it.
Yeah, how to come out of it.
I mean, we have to have a wake-up call and say, well, actually, I'm not going to submit to this power of control operating through this person in my family or wherever the person is.
Yeah.
And actually, we have to stand up to them. Now, of course, the first day that we stand up to them and say, no, we aren't going to do what you want, you can expect the most almighty explosion.
Yeah. So what happens if a person's fearful of that? What happens if a person is scared of that explosion or scared of the relationship fracturing or becoming estranged? Fear of, even at its worst case, if you're in a marriage where this control is taking place, fear of the family home breaking apart. All of that, all of those reasons I could imagine would put a constraint on ever confronting this.
Yes, I mean, this is ends up being a spiritual matter.
Right.
So, of course, if you're actually confronting a spirit that's operating through mother-in-law or whoever it is, then, of course, we need to spiritually warfare.
Right.
And we need to ask God for the right time to do it. And also maybe have a bit of reinforcements.
Yes.
But you can obviously take authority over powers of darkness operating through people.
Yeah.
And bind them down and so on. So that's really to start with. Even on the telephone, I've had people fearful of having their Friday evening phone call from this person, and to be able to really pray beforehand and say, I love the person, but I hate the control.
I think that is so helpful, Jill, because I can just imagine that there are people watching with particular members in the family who they love, they truly love, but the relationship itself is so difficult because ever since they were a child, they were made to feel ashamed or criticised, or there's these sort of passive ways of manipulating. And so it's extremely difficult when you love a person and you want to have a relationship, but every time you have this phone call or this contact, this kind of insidious way of relating starts to happen. It's an extremely difficult experience.
So in the end, we have to say to the person, look, I love you for who you are, my mum or my mother-in-law or my friend or my husband or whatever, but actually I need to tell you that I'm no longer going to come underneath your control.
Yes.
And you need to recognise that I'm an adult, I've got opinions and that need to be expressed and validated.
Okay.
And I'm not going to do this anymore.
So can I ask you some important questions scripturally that come to mind? Because I can imagine a couple of scenarios in this situation. So you have a person whose parents control, and as a Christian we could think, well, how do we fit this together with the idea of honouring our parents, behaving in a way that honours and is respectful? I could imagine that there could be a blurring or confusion sometimes when it comes to honouring and yet not submitting to ungodly control. Could you please speak to that?
Yes, I mean, we don't actually honour our parents by coming underneath an ungodly power that operates through them.
Yes.
And God never asks us to do that. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to be rude. So don't have to be disrespectful. We can just straightforwardly say, I am not coming underneath your control anymore.
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you need to hear me say this.
Yeah.
And I want a good relationship with you, but actually where it's a 50-50 thing, you know, where I'm allowed to contribute and make my, you know, my wants and opinions known,
Yeah.
and had to be listened to, perhaps even, you know, and to have them as part of what we do together.
I think it's so helpful, Jill, that you're able to affirm that in a person, that they actually, before God, can stand up with good conscience and know that they're still honouring their parents and yet really defining a boundary, I guess you could say. The other thing I wanted to ask you about too is in a marriage situation, because in Ephesians 5, for example, we have the model for marriage outlined. So that's where we have the principles of headship and submission in a marriage situation. Again, I could see the potential for this to be confused with ungodly control at times and in certain situations. Could you please describe the difference between godly leadership and submission and ungodly control in a marriage?
Yes. I mean, first of all, submission is always the free will choice of the person doing the submitting.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not just husbands and wives. I mean, obviously that's one we'll talk about now, but it's submit to your elders and leaders because they're accountable to God for you.
Yes.
And then submit to God, resist the devil and he will flee.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of submitting, everybody, not just wives, has to do. But it's always a free will choice of the person doing the submitting.
Mm-hmm.
So if a husband is saying to his wife, it says in the Bible, you wives submit to your husbands, and so you'll jolly well submit to me. He's absolutely rank out of order.
Right.
Because that is not the whole purpose of submitting is that we choose to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we can easily come under ungodly control by wrong interpretation of what submission is. I mean, God wants us to submit to him, but he's not enforcing us to do that. He wants it to be a free will heart response.
Mm-hmm. So what comes to mind for me as you describe that is the possibility of a married couple potentially vying for control in a marriage where you have two people who are unwilling to, or a wife who doesn't submit, and this sort of domination and this kind of back and forward. Have you come across that? And
yes, and I think it's pretty ungodly. It really
right.
needs sorting at
Yes.
the root and not allow it to drift on. We, as a wife, we need to recognise that God has raised up husbands to lead and to head up the marriage. But the husband has to love his wife more than he loves himself.
Yes.
And actually has to love his wife in the same way as Christ loved the church. And he laid down his life for the church.
Yes.
So I've never met a wife that had a problem with submitting to a husband that she knew loved her more than he loved himself.
There are so many questions that come to mind for me as we describe this, and we only have about 3 minutes left on the program, Jill, and just for the remaining time, it might be good to come back to this as a full program. Control in churches.
Yes.
Before the program, we were speaking about this idea of heavy shepherding from leadership.
Yes.
Perhaps we could do another program on
yes,
this topic.
that'd be very good.
But just to touch on it in the meantime, if somebody's watching and they are in a church situation where they do feel dominated or manipulated in some way, that their free will is being usurped in some way by the leadership at church, could you speak about that situation and
yes,
what to do?
I mean, we had a situation where somebody was wanting to take promotion in their job, and it meant them moving to another town. And the leader came and said, you cannot move to another town because we need you here running our cell group. And if you move, God will take his hand off your life. Now, that is what I call heavy shepherding.
Yes.
Okay. We always need to allow people to go, even if we think they've heard wrong, even if we think it's not God. We should always bless and release people into doing what they believe is right, regardless. And then when we don't, and we start to say, well, actually, God will take his hand off your life, I think it's huge manipulation.
It's very damaging, actually.
Very damaging. That's what we would call that heavy shepherding.
Yes, I could see how it would undermine a person's confidence spiritually and in their circumstances completely. It's so, Jill, this has given us a taster perhaps for another program that we could do. In the remaining minute, can I just ask for a few thoughts on how a person might respond to this in order to come out of any kind of ungodly control that they recognise?
Yes. The first thing is to submit to God and to say, Lord, would you help me? I think this relationship has got out of hand. I'm submitting to ungodly control. Would you come and show me the path out and help me? And then look for strength from God and direction from God first, and pray about the right timing. And then we will need to stand up to the person. And that takes courage.
That takes courage.
Yeah.
So at that point, what could you offer some encouragement or guidance to what somebody might do in terms of getting the support they need to take that step?
Yes, I mean, if it was a marital thing, it might be helpful to go to the pastor and ask for help.
Jill, your input has been so helpful, so interesting, and it's given us a taster for more to come, so thank you very much. We hope the program has been an encouragement to you. We look forward to joining you next week, and in the meantime, may God bless you. Bye-bye.